The Filipino sun rose relentlessly over the busy streets of Manila, illuminating the harsh reality of Roberto Santos, a 73-year-old man who pushed his precarious metal cart through the narrow alleys of the city. The deep wrinkles on his face told stories of decades of struggle, while his calloused hands rummaged through trash bins in search of recyclable materials that could be sold for a few pesos. After his wife's death 3 years earlier, Roberto had lost not only his great love, but also the small rented house where they had lived for decades, forcing him to sleep in a makeshift shelter under a bridge. That particular morning, Roberto's body ached more than usual, a consequence of a rainy night and the dampness that penetrated his tired bones. His trembling legs barely supported his thin body as he traversed the neighborhood of Quezon City, an area known for the social contrasts typical of the Filipino capital. Despite the pain, the elderly man maintained a silent dignity in his gaze, a heritage of a life dedicated to honest work, even when fate had robbed him of almost everything. In another part of the city, Manny Pacquiao drove his car discreetly through the streets of Manila, seeking a moment of reflection away from the spotlight that constantly followed him. The famous Filipino boxer and senator had grown up in extreme poverty before achieving glory in the rings and in politics, and had never forgotten his humble origins. That morning, after an exhausting meeting in the Senate, he decided to drive alone through the streets of the city that had seen him grow, feeling the need to reconnect with the reality of the people he represented. Fate worked its mysterious ways when Manny, stopping at a red light, noticed through the car window an elderly scavenger stumbling as he pushed his heavy cart. The scene deeply touched the boxer's heart, who saw in that fragile old man the image of his own grandfather, who had passed away years before. There was something in the silent dignity of the old man, in the way he struggled despite evident difficulties, that captured the world champion's attention. Driven by an inexplicable impulse, Pacquiao parked his car discreetly and began to follow the elderly man at a distance, observing with growing admiration and concern the dedication with which Roberto collected plastic bottles and cardboards, meticulously organizing them in his cart. The contrast between his own life of comfort and privileges and the daily struggle of that gentleman to survive provoked in Manny a deep reflection on the paths of life and the responsibilities that came with his success and influence. Roberto stopped to rest briefly in the shade of a tree, sitting on the curb while wiping sweat from his forehead with a faded piece of cloth. His lunch consisted of a small bread roll that a kind lady had given him earlier, accompanied by water from a reused bottle he always carried with him. The simplicity of that meal and the genuine gratitude that the elderly man showed while savoring it made Manny feel a lump in his throat, remembering the days when his own family barely had anything to eat. From across the street, maintaining a discreet distance, Pacquiao observed every movement of the elderly man, noting the details that silently told the story of a life of deprivation. Clothes mended several times, worn-out sandals with almost non-existent soles, the care with which he saved every penny found on the ground. The memory of his own childhood in General Santos City, when he slept on the floor and went days without proper meals, came back with full force, creating an invisible connection between the famous boxer and the anonymous collector. After the brief rest, Roberto returned to work with renewed determination, now entering a more affluent neighborhood where residents used to discard items in better condition. Manny continued to follow him discreetly, admiring the persistence of the old man who, despite his age and debilitated physical condition, did not give in to discouragement. The boxer noticed that, among the collectors they encountered along the way, Roberto was treated with special respect, something that spoke about his character and history within that community invisible to many. The moment that would change the lives of both happened when Roberto, trying to reach a pile of cardboards behind a store, lost his balance and fell heavily to the ground, scattering the contents of his cart. The evident pain on his face as he unsuccessfully tried to get up was the trigger Manny needed to intervene. Without thinking twice, the famous boxer ran towards the elderly man, kneeling beside him and gently helping him back to his feet, while quickly collecting the scattered materials. The look of surprise in Roberto's tired eyes as he recognized the iconic figure helping him slowly transformed into a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Manny Pacquiao, the pride of the Philippines, was there, kneeling on the dirty ground, picking up plastic bottles beside him. With respect and genuine concern, the boxer asked about his health and living conditions, listening attentively as the elderly man, with a voice choked by emotion, briefly shared his story of struggles and losses, never asking for anything beyond the dignity of being able to work. Deeply touched by Roberto's story and the dignity with which he faced his difficulties, Manny decided at that moment that he needed to do something significant. Without fanfare, he invited the elderly man for coffee at a small diner nearby, where they could talk better away from the curious looks that were beginning to recognize the famous boxer. The humility with which Roberto accepted the invitation, worrying first about securing his cart and belongings in a safe place, spoke volumes about the character of a man who, even in adversity, kept his values intact. In the simplicity of that local establishment, between cups of strong coffee and fresh bread, a conversation unfolded that transcended social and generational barriers. Roberto told how he had worked for 40 years as a bricklayer, building houses he could never buy, until health problems prevented him from continuing in the trade. He spoke of his deceased wife after a prolonged illness that consumed all their savings, of his children who had migrated to other countries in search of opportunities and rarely could send help, and of how, little by little, he had seen his life crumble until finding himself homeless and dependent on collecting recyclables to survive. Manny listened attentively, recognizing in that story elements that could easily have been his own destiny, had it not been for the opportunity that boxing had provided him. The elderly man's genuine gratitude for the simple gesture of being heard with respect, without pity or condescension, deeply touched the heart of the world champion who, at that moment, saw clearly his purpose beyond the rings and politics. As they talked, Pacquiao made a silent decision that would forever change the life of that gentleman who, despite all difficulties, maintained a serene look and an unwavering dignity. At the end of the meeting, without grand announcements or empty promises, Manny asked for the contact of the shelter where Roberto occasionally spent the nights and some basic data that he discreetly noted on his cell phone. The elderly man, not imagining what was to come, thanked emotionally for the coffee, the conversation, and especially for the respect with which he had been treated by someone he considered a national hero. The farewell was simple, but loaded with a genuine human connection that transcended any social difference, leaving both transformed by the unexpected encounter. In the following weeks, while Roberto continued his daily routine of collecting through the streets of Manila, a discreet team worked intensely under specific guidance from Manny Pacquiao. The boxer had mobilized part of his charitable foundation for a special project, kept in absolute secrecy to avoid media exposure. Architects, builders, and social workers moved silently, preparing something that no one, much less the elderly collector, could imagine. On a Saturday morning, Roberto was gently approached by a social worker who introduced herself as a collaborator of the Pacquiao Foundation. With delicacy, she explained that the senator and boxer had been touched by his story and would like to invite him to see a community project. Confused but intrigued, the elderly man agreed to be driven in a simple car to a middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Manila, where small colorful houses formed an organized and welcoming community, quite different from the degraded areas where he usually circulated. Upon arriving at a yellow two-bedroom house, with a small veranda adorned with pots of tropical plants, Roberto was greeted by a smiling Manny Pacquiao, who awaited him at the entrance. The boxer, dressed simply and without the usual entourage that accompanied him in public appearances, personally led the surprised elderly man inside the modest but impeccably furnished and decorated residence. With emotion contained in his voice, Manny explained that that house, fully equipped with furniture, appliances, and basic supplies, was now Roberto's new home. The incredulity on the wrinkled face of the collector slowly transformed into an understanding that seemed almost painful in its intensity. His trembling legs barely supported him as he walked through the rooms of the house, reverently touching the solid walls, the soft bed, the shiny pots in the kitchen, simple comforts that had become unattainable luxuries in his recent reality. When Manny handed him the keys and documents proving that the property was legally registered in his name, without any debts or future charges, the old man finally succumbed to the emotion he was trying to contain. The tears that streamed down Roberto's sun-marked and time-marked face carried the weight of decades of struggle, sacrifice, and recently, hopelessness. Without words that could adequately express his gratitude, the elderly man simply hugged Manny with the strength his fragile arms allowed, in a gesture that conveyed more than any elaborate speech could. The boxer, equally moved, returned the embrace with respect and affection, explaining that that gesture was not charity, but recognition of the dignity and strength with which Roberto had faced life's adversities. The surprise, however, did not end there. Manny revealed that, in addition to the house, Roberto would receive a lifelong monthly pension from the Pacquiao Foundation, sufficient to live with dignity without needing to collect recyclable materials anymore. Additionally, the foundation had located his children abroad and provided tickets for them to visit him, as well as created a fund to ensure that the elderly man had access to quality medical care for the rest of his life. The impact of those revelations was so overwhelming that Roberto needed to sit down, while silent tears of relief and gratitude continued to flow freely. In the following weeks, the transformation in Roberto's life was extraordinary. His body, previously bent by the weight of strenuous work and sleepless nights, gradually began to recover. Adequate nutrition, a comfortable mattress, and regular medical monitoring promoted visible improvements in his physical health. More impressive, however, was the change in his countenance. His once resigned eyes now shone with renewed hope and purpose, while the expression of constant concern gave way to a serene smile that rarely left his face. The reunion with his children, who arrived from the Philippines and Canada for a 2-week visit, was a moment of intense emotion and reconciliation. Years of distance forced by the need for survival were overcome in long conversations on the veranda of the new house, where memories were shared and new bonds were woven. The pride in the children's eyes as they saw their father finally in a dignified and secure home was an additional gift that Manny, without knowing, had provided to that family for so long separated by poverty and distance. Discreetly, Manny Pacquiao kept himself informed about Roberto's adaptation to his new life, receiving regular reports from the social worker assigned to follow the case. The boxer made a point of personally visiting the elderly man occasionally, always without prior announcements or media coverage, genuinely interested in his well-being and his transition to a life of dignity. These visits gradually transformed into an unlikely but sincere friendship, based on mutual respect and the humble origins that both shared, despite the drastically different paths their lives had taken. Roberto's story, however, did not remain a secret for long. A neighbor, recognizing Manny during one of his discreet visits, photographed the moment when the boxer and the former collector were chatting animatedly on the veranda of the yellow house. The image, shared on social media, quickly went viral, generating a wave of national and international commotion. The simplicity of the gesture, the absence of self-promotion on the part of the famous boxer, and the visible transformation in the elderly man's life deeply touched the public, at a time when stories of genuine compassion seemed increasingly rare. Pressured by the media that now camped near Roberto's house, Manny finally gave a brief press conference, in which he explained his motivation with simple but powerful words. "I did nothing extraordinary, just shared a little of the blessings I received with someone who deserves dignity and respect. We are all responsible for one another, and no one should spend their last years collecting garbage to survive after a lifetime of honest work." The sincerity and humility in his speech, coupled with the evident emotion in his voice, further amplified the impact of the story, inspiring a national movement of appreciation and support for elderly people in vulnerable situations in the Philippines. The impact of Roberto and Manny's story quickly transcended Philippine borders, becoming a global phenomenon that touched hearts on different continents. Major international media outlets produced special reports on the case, highlighting not only the famous boxer's gesture, but primarily the dignity with which the elderly man had faced years of adversity. The images of the former collector in his new home, recovering his health and joy of living, contrasted with previous photos showing him pushing his cart of recyclable materials, became a powerful symbol of the difference that an act of genuine compassion can make in a person's life. Inspired by the example, ordinary citizens, celebrities, and businesspeople in the Philippines and other countries began to create similar initiatives, identifying elderly people in vulnerable situations in their communities and offering concrete support beyond punctual charity. The Pacquiao Foundation saw its donations increase exponentially, allowing the expansion of the project initially conceived for Roberto. In a few months, an entire community of small colorful houses began to be built on the outskirts of Manila, designed to accommodate homeless elderly people who, like Roberto, had worked all their lives but found themselves helpless in old age. Roberto, in turn, discovered a new purpose for his life. Initially shy in the face of sudden attention, he gradually found his voice as an advocate for the rights of the elderly and homeless people. With the simplicity and wisdom acquired in decades of struggle, he began to participate in lectures at schools and universities, sharing his story without self-pity or resentment, but as a testimony to the importance of solidarity and respect for human dignity in any circumstance. His central message, repeated with conviction at every opportunity, was that no one should be defined or limited by their current socio-economic condition. The relationship between Manny and Roberto deepened over time, evolving into a genuine friendship that transcended the initial dynamic of benefactor and beneficiary. The boxer frequently invited the elderly man to family events and informal gatherings at his home, treating him with the same respect and consideration dedicated to longtime friends. For Manny, that unlikely friendship became a constant source of inspiration and perspective, reminding him of the humble roots that formed his character and the essential values that no fame or wealth should obscure. In an emotional ceremony on the first anniversary of the encounter that had changed their lives, Manny surprised everyone by announcing the creation of the Roberto Santos program, a comprehensive initiative of his foundation specifically aimed at elderly people in vulnerable situations. The program, developed with the active participation of Roberto himself, included not only dignified housing but also access to health care, work opportunities adapted to the limitations of age, cultural activities, and mainly, a community environment that combated the social isolation often associated with old age in conditions of poverty. The elderly man, who a year before slept under a bridge, now had his name eternalized in a project that would transform thousands of lives. The second year after the transformative encounter brought new developments that no one could have predicted. The story of Manny and Roberto had inspired a renowned Filipino film director to create a movie based on the former collector's life and his unlikely friendship with the world champion boxer. With sensitivity and respect, the production portrayed not only the moment of the house donation but Roberto's entire trajectory. His poor childhood in the countryside, the years of hard work as a bricklayer, the sacrifices to raise his children, the painful loss of his wife, and the subsequent spiral of poverty that had led him to the streets. In parallel, the film showed Manny's own journey from the slums to stardom, creating a powerful parallel between two lives marked by struggle and resilience. The premiere of the film, which featured the emotional presence of Roberto, accompanied by his children and grandchildren who came from abroad especially for the occasion, was a cultural phenomenon in the Philippines. Crowds packed the cinemas, driven both by Manny Pacquiao's popularity and the inspiring story that had captured the national imagination. Critics highlighted the respectful and non-sensationalist way in which the narrative had been constructed, avoiding clichés of savior and victim, to present a genuine encounter between two human beings who, despite drastically different circumstances, shared fundamental values such as dignity, work, and perseverance. National success soon expanded internationally, with the film being selected for important festivals and winning awards that highlighted its humanist message. Distribution rights were sold to various countries, with a condition imposed by Manny and Roberto that a significant portion of the profits be allocated to projects supporting elderly people in vulnerable situations, not only in the Philippines but in each country where the film was shown. Thus, the story that had begun with a casual encounter on a street in Manila gained global proportions, generating concrete resources to replicate the support model in different cultural and economic contexts. For Roberto, now 75 years old and enjoying significantly improved health, the new fame brought opportunities he had never imagined. Invitations to participate in international conferences on aging and human dignity arrived regularly, taking him to places he had not visited even in his most optimistic dreams. With humility and wisdom, The elderly man shared his story at prestigious universities, international forums, and television programs, always emphasizing that his case should not be seen as exceptional, but as an example of what should be guaranteed to all elderly people after a life of contribution to society. The most significant and lasting impact, however, manifested in the tangible changes in public policies that the story inspired. In the Philippines, after intense popular mobilization partially motivated by the film and Roberto's lectures, the Senate approved a comprehensive law for the protection of the elderly, informally called the Roberto Santos Law. The legislation, which had the decisive support of Manny Pacquiao in its processing, established a national non-contributory pension system for low-income elderly people, specific housing programs, and a set of health services adapted to the needs of the elderly. Neighboring countries in Southeast Asia began to implement similar legislation, creating a positive domino effect that would benefit millions of elderly people in the region. 3 years after the encounter that had changed their lives, Manny Pacquiao and Roberto Santos found themselves sitting on the veranda of the Yellow House, observing the Filipino sunset while sharing memories and reflections. The former collector, now a respected activist for the rights of the elderly, preserved the humility and gratitude that had always characterized him, even after all the extraordinary transformations in his life. The boxer, in turn, frequently commented that he had received much more than he had given in that relationship, referring to the lessons of dignity, resilience, and wisdom he had learned from his unlikely friend, and that now profoundly influenced his decisions as a public figure and legislator. The community where Roberto lived had changed significantly, becoming an innovative model of assisted living for low-income elderly people. What had begun as a single yellow house had evolved into a harmonious complex of colorful residences, arranged around common areas that promoted socialization and mutual support among residents. Community gardens, spaces for cultural activities, and a small health center completed the project, which now housed more than 100 elderly people previously in vulnerable situations. Most notable was the community spirit that flourished there. The residents were not treated as passive recipients of charity, but as active members of a small community where their experiences and wisdom were valued. Internationally, the model developed from Roberto and Manny's story continued to expand, adapting to different cultural and economic contexts. Delegations from various countries regularly visited the project in the Philippines, seeking inspiration for similar initiatives in their own nations. The film based on the story had become teaching material in schools and universities, generating discussions about dignified aging, social responsibility, and the value of work in a society increasingly oriented by consumption and disposability. More important than the institutional reach, however, were the countless individual stories of ordinary people who, inspired by the example, had decided to make a concrete difference in the lives of elderly people in their own communities. For Roberto's children and grandchildren, the transformation went far beyond the material comfort provided by the new house and financial security. The possibility of maintaining regular contact with the family patriarch, now facilitated by the stability of his situation and access to communication technologies previously inaccessible, had revitalized family ties that poverty and distance had weakened. The pride with which they now spoke of their father and grandfather, not only for his story of overcoming, but for the positive impact he was generating in the lives of so many other people, was evident in every family interaction, creating a legacy of values that transcended generations. In a simple but emotional ceremony to mark the 3rd anniversary of the encounter, Manny Pacquiao and Roberto Santos planted a fruit tree together in the center of the community that had been born from that unlikely friendship. The symbolism of the gesture did not go unnoticed by those present. Just as the tree would grow slowly, offering shade, beauty, and food to future generations, the impact of that story would continue to expand far beyond the lives immediately touched. As silent tears of gratitude streamed down Roberto's wrinkled face, reflecting the golden of the Filipino sunset, it was impossible not to think of the countless lives transformed by a moment of genuine empathy on a busy street in Manila. 3 years earlier, a seemingly casual encounter that had transformed into a global movement of dignity and respect for the elderly. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.